son of Charlemagne, Barbara Willard. Chapter 9. King Offa's daughter. The envoys from King Offa had brought with them as gifts examples of their country's wares: wool and furs, a beaten copper vessel of magnificent dimensions, a chased golden chalice, a sword of bronze with a jeweled hilt of antique design. Also, a portrait of the princess, his daughter, executed, the envoy said, by a deacon of York who had spent some time at the Mercian court, instructing the king and his family. The portrait was an illuminated drawing on a scroll of parchment contained within an ornamented cylinder of gold. While the woolens and the furs and the rest of the gifts were presented to the king, along with many protestations of kingly friendship, the golden cylinder, with its contained portrait, was presented to Karl. Karl took out the parchment and unrolled it slowly. The face of a young girl, crudely enough delineated, stared back at him. He might have grimaced at the flat oval of the face, the great eyes, the high forehead under the little gold crown, and the small curling mouth. But as he gazed at the parchment, the harsh lines of the portrait seemed to melt into the softness of flesh. The large eyes seemed to shine with a steadfast, yet a merry light. The mouth quirked up at the corner in a smile. Even the stiff flower she held in one hand seemed to blush and breathe. With a great gush of happiness, Karl looked up from the portrait into the waiting, anxious faces of the envoys. "The lady is beautiful," he said. Then everyone present smiled in a contented fashion. Later, the king called Karl to his own apartments. They had dined hugely because of the guests, and the king had retired to rest, as he liked to do for 2 hours after eating. He was lying on a low couch, and over his knees he had pulled one of the skins brought by the Mercians. He was handling it in appraisal and satisfaction when Karl came in. "They have fine beasts in their forests on that island," he said. He looked at his son and chuckled suddenly. "And fine women, Karl?" Karl looked with affection at his father's great frame stretched out there on the couch, at his beard flowing splendidly on his chest, and the fineness of his strong hands. "Is it true that King Offa will give me his daughter?" Karl asked. "He is eager." "And you?" "Yes," Karl agreed. "I too." By the window, Fastrada was sitting working at a tapestry. She stitched spasmodically. She left the dull and difficult parts to her ladies. One sat there beside her now, silent and subdued as Fastrada's ladies seemed always to be. "So we are to have barbarians at court," Fastrada said. "The Mercians do not appear barbarian," the king replied mildly. "An English princess," said Fastrada, "will be strange to our ways. They are savages there, as everyone knows." "Is Alcuin a savage?" the king asked. "Alcuin is a man of God." "He is also an Englishman, Fastrada. You need not fear King Offa's daughter will be any less couth." "Karl is not being offered a princess of the Avars for his wife." The Avars were a Mongol race of whose fierceness and savagery terrible tales were told. On a distant plain, they dwelt within a fortress called the Ring. 9 concentric rows of fortifications were there, guarding, it was said, great stores of treasure. Many and many a time in the past had the king spoken of making an expedition against the Avars, but lately the enterprises had seemed to slip among other enterprises spoken of, but unplanned. "What do you say, my son?" the king cried now. "Shall we wait until the day the Avars are conquered and bring you the Kagan's daughter in a golden cage?" Karl laughed. He had seldom felt more fondly toward his father. He wished that the king were here alone, that they might speak privately together. but it was increasingly difficult to detach Fastrada from the king's side. Karl would have liked to tell about his dreams of this princess, who had so unexpectedly been offered to him in marriage, how he had heard her spoken of as much as 2 years ago, and how ever since he had imagined her becoming his wife. To speak of these rather boyish fantasies was impossible in Fastrada's presence. So he could only say, "I will have Offa's daughter, if that pleases you, my lord." "I think it pleases me," his father answered. He put out his hand, took Karl by the wrist, and gave him a hard, warm pressure. "We will send the envoys back with tidings that should please them all. It is time we had a marriage in this family. It is high time." The thought of Bertha stabbed at Karl's conscience. He felt a traitor to his father, and again he was deeply moved by the thought of trouble to come. There was, in fact, trouble the following day. Summoned before the king, the envoys of King Offa received with respectful pleasure the news that the king of the Franks accepted the English king's daughter for his son. Karl stood beside his father's chair when the acceptance was made. He could not tell what he felt as the Mercians turned to him and bowed deeply. "This is an honor for our master's daughter," said one. "But a joy, too, for the Lord Karl," said a second. "The lady is beautiful, and she sings as a bird sings. She is forever busy about her womanly concerns. She stitches finely, embroiders well. Her voice is merry, and she laughs often. Blessed be your days with her, young Lord Karl. Blessed be hers with you and with your children." "Blessed indeed," replied the chief spokesman among them. "And if, to help the lady's impatience, we may bear back with us a likeness." Karl laughed. "I am a soldier, Englishman. Who makes likenesses of soldiers, save only God?" "We will make a likeness with words," said the man from Mercia. "How tall, how keen of eye, how strong of voice and purpose, how devout, how skilled in battle, how apt in learning, how fine a son to make as fine a husband." Karl held up his hands in protest and alarm. "If you make me out a giant, a saint, and a scholar, how shall I stop her tears when she sees me as I am?" In celebration of a piece of business well concluded, the king called for wine. The king drank to his fellow king, Offa of Mercia, and to the daughter-in-law he had willingly accepted. The envoys drank also to their own master, then to their young prince's future husband. Karl drank to the wife who would one day be his. Goodwill flowed and overflowed. No embassy could have reached a more amicable conclusion. "For the rest of our embassy," the leader of the Mercians now said, "we have also a happy proposal to make in the name of our king. He too has a son. That son is his heir, and will one day be king of Mercia. And that son, our young prince, also seeks a wife. It is the earnest hope of our master, Lord King, that you will vouchsafe your daughter, the Lady Bertha, as a wife for King Offa's son and heir." Karl felt his face stiffen. He glanced in panic from his father to his father's secretary. Only Einhard in that gathering could know how dangerous a moment this was. The king's face, too, had changed from its friendliness and condescension to a cautious watchfulness. "Daughter for daughter?" he asked. "Is this what King Offa intends?" "It is to be a mutual happiness," the envoy murmured. "Is it indeed so?" the king said with a short laugh. "I am to give my daughter as a hostage for his? Is that his meaning?" "Hostage is no word to use, one king to another." "It is the word I use," King Charles replied, "as would any other man of sense. What do you say, Karl?" "It is not likely that my sister would care to leave her home so far behind," Karl said cautiously. "Nor would I send her so far." It is the same distance, Lord, as our master will send his daughter for your son. It is not to be thought of. The envoys looked at one another uneasily, and excusing themselves, they moved together momentarily, and spoke in low voices in their own tongue. The smiles had given way to anxious frowns. The whispering, though neither Karl nor the king himself could follow what was being said, was palpably agitated. Einhard sat looking from Karl to the king, from the king to the envoys. At this purely state conference, Fastrada was not present. Karl turned his back on Einhard and tried to straighten and order his own thoughts. In his heart, he had known that the negotiations were going too smoothly. Deep impatience stirred in him. He wanted this princess for his own, and that there should be delay or anger over the terms on which he obtained her filled him with rage and helplessness. At last, the spokesman of the 4 envoys addressed himself again to the king. My lord, may not the lady be consulted? The king laughed. It is a foolhardy father who allows his daughters to choose the men they fancy. He can at least protect them from their own folly. A girl may love where she pleases, but to her own danger. It is by no means certain that her hand can, in good sense, be allowed to follow her heart. Then we must say this to our master. King Charles of the Franks finds himself unable to accept the marriage offers. Karl tried to tell himself he was happy that Bertha had been saved the disclosure of her marriage with Engelbert. He loved his sister and wished nothing but good to her, but his anxiety on his own account changed at this moment to despair. You must say to your master, replied King Charles, that I do not part easily with my daughters, but they shall welcome his as a sister among them. Alas, said the envoy, that cannot be. It is expressly stated in our embassy that the one must depend upon the other. For my lord, why should one prince be granted a bride when the other is denied his choice? We too will echo that. Alas, said King, but we cannot find a word we would all prefer. He rose, and the rest rose with him. The audience is ended, he said. He put out his hand to Karl, who moved toward him. With his hand on the arm of his eldest son, and without a backward glance, King Charles of the Franks quitted the envoys sent so hopefully from so far. Once out of earshot, striding down the gallery to his own apartments, the king laughed. Karl, you look very sour. Forgive me, but this is nothing. There are hundreds of ladies as beautiful, as sensible, and no doubt with as bird-like voices. Come, you must rally. I have seldom seen you so glum. It will not be difficult to find you a lovely and loving wife. Or at least, he added with a flare of anger, not if you look like a man instead of a sullen schoolboy. He turned away abruptly to rejoin Fastrada, who would nod her head in a knowing way. Did I not say this was a barbarian king of a barbarian court? Not to trust his daughter here? Heaven save us from all such monsters. But her true satisfaction would be in the discomfiture of the king's heir. Karl returned the way he had come, unable even to remonstrate with his father in his own cause. He felt sick with disappointment. He could hardly believe that his promised happiness had been snatched away from him so abruptly and so soon. In vain, he told himself that all reports might lie, that the girl might in fact be squat and ill-tempered, squint-eyed and violent of mood. As he wrestled with his feeling of terrible frustration and wretchedness, Karl saw his brother Gobbo moving away down a far stairway with 3 or 4 of the young men who had recently formed themselves into a group about him. making him a little court and a following of his own. There were the sons, without exception, of men who had first come to court in attendance on Gobbo's mother, the king's first wife. Moving away in a group, as they were now doing, they gave the impression of being partners in some enterprise, one which they intended to be secret. They spoke to one another in low voices, then looked quickly round as though they might have been overheard. Carl shrugged impatiently. His own troubles filled his mind. He could not be bothered now with whatever mischief Gobbo might be up to. He went to his bedchamber and lay on his bed. If he were Rotred, he thought, he would pray and find relief. If he were Lewis, he would be kneeling in the chapel with his grief. If he were Pepin, he would no doubt be about the business of seeking another bride as quickly as possible. Instead, he lay moaning in wretchedness on his bed. Hard as he tried, he was unable to pray, unable to drag himself to his feet. All his efforts at gaining the same iron firmness as his father had now vanished into nothingness. He was pinned down by his loneliness, by the feeling that he was less a son to his father than a pawn in the game of politics and power that was being played out in Europe. He knew in his heart that more than politics and temporal power were involved, but in the bitterness and sadness of his thought, at this moment, he saw only what blunders his father might have made as he moved toward his great objective. He remembered Verdun and the massacre of the Saxons, the lands laid waste, the outcry of those wretched people who had been shifted from their homes because they had revolted against the Frankish rule, or against Christianity. He thought how they had been transported and resettled by the thousands in territories they did not know, which they must colonize or perish. He forgot the schools and the churches, the new just laws that took account of things till now ignored, the pleasant home life of learning and music and sport, the exaltation of the church, the respect and affection of Pope Hadrian for this mighty king. Carl knew his father wise and just. He loved him with all his heart, even though Frustrata had raised a barrier between them. But all that concerned him now was a young man's sad and bitter disappointment at the loss of his lady. His servant came in and stood awkwardly, astounded to find him lolling there on his bed. "It is a message from the Mercian envoys, Lord Carl. They return at once to their own country. They ask for the portrait of the princess." "Take it!" Carl cried, but as the man took up the portrait, Charles checked him. "No, wait. Give it to me." He unrolled the parchment. He looked again, and for the last time, at the small, proud head with its golden diadem, at the wide brown eyes, the curling mouth, the flower. He waited for the face to live as it had seemed to live before, but it remained flat and withdrawn, a portrait of a remote princess who would never draw closer to him now.